two robots walk into a bar. First robot orders a martini. Bartender waves him off. You don't serve robots. Second robot leans in and says, you will. So, are we going to serve the robots, or are the robots going to serve us? Robots need rules. When we talk about digital transformation and AI, we have two spheres of thinking. One is one that's rule-based, RPA, it's prescriptive, where we tell the robots what to do. The second is where the systems learn, which is really the realm of AI. We're going to talk about both of them. When we think about digital transformation, we can think of it in terms of three R's: robots, relationships, and rules. Rules are unambiguous, and that's critical for robots. We don't want robots making decisions on their own, whether they're actual robots that are moving around, or if it's the software that we're using. There's no room for nuance with robotic automation. But when we think about automation that we have today, think about this picture and the pathways that we're defining. So here's a warehouse automation scenario. Here, clearly a lot of thought went into what is precisely the right way to move packages down the pathway as expediently as possible. And that's largely what our automation looks like today. A lot of upfront design and engineering to make it work as effectively as possible. But the pathways don't know and don't care what's going on top. There's no adaptation here. There's no context. So while this is the realm of most automation today, digital transformation looks like this. Does anybody know whose warehouse this would be?
Bezos.
Well, yes. I don't think it's his personal warehouse. But this is the Amazon warehouse. Amazon uses robots to move stuff around. They're adapting. They're thinking, sort of. What they're taking is rules and data, but they're applying learning so that they're actually making some decisions about where stuff is being put in order for that to be accessed more effectively in the future. So the notion of pathway, like in the previous picture, doesn't really exist at all. You know, it's exactly the same outcome. It's how do we get something out the door as quick as possible? Clearly, that's become the cornerstone of Amazon's business model. It's the expediency around delivery. It's not price, it's not availability. Those aren't things that can be matched in the context of the internet now. What can be addressed is how do they move things more effectively, in this case more efficiently or faster. And that's around using the combination of data, rules, and adaptivity to be able to get that out the door. So when we think about digital transformation and the context of AI and intelligent automation, it's data-driven. We do care about the payload, about the package, about the work that's being done. And it's driven by goals rather than pathways, and ultimately makes it adaptable. Increasingly, from our standpoint, because we're not getting boxes out the door, think about it in terms of the way that we affect work is with experience and data that's outside of our control. Where more and more the experience is happening on the side of the consumer. And our ability to adapt, our ability to learn from that data to apply the combination of their policies, in the case of our types of customers, their rules and our rules, to be able to achieve those goals more quickly. But think about this from the standpoint of a disruption. Think about how you work today, how we work, where that's happening. From our standpoint, we're framed around the lens of our laptop from a consumer standpoint, in terms of who are we affecting at the end of that transaction, at the end of that process. Chances are it's not in front of a laptop, it's in front of some kind of a device. But how long will that last? Think about a world not too far away, where the vast majority of those transactions, from their standpoint, and even increasingly our standpoint, the way that we work is not framed around a static device that we have control over today. Just to put into context how things changed. We had, in recent history, two events that give us a really unique lens on how culture, expectations, and our orientation shifts. Does anybody know, anybody other than Huey, know what's going on here? St. Peter's Square, 2005. A crowd is assembled. They're anxiously awaiting news about new Pope. And for, what is, really an anomaly, we had two popes announced in really close succession. So we can look at that one event where we had a large crowd and, it was an important event. We can use that as a lens to think about how has our world changed. This is kind of like the aging challenge. How is the world different, just not even 10 years later? And it was markedly different. What happened? What happened in '05? So the release of, first, the iPhone, something that seemed innovative, like an iPod with a phone, actually fundamentally transformed industries, consumer experience, how we build applications. One of the most disruptive events in our lifetimes, really. But there's obviously a lesson to learn here. And if you look at how this has affected everything from how content is sold and delivered and monetized, how software is built, how we interact with the customer, there are critical lessons to be learned here. This has been the most transformative event, but are we learning the right lessons? Anybody here of Roy Amira? No. He's the futurist. This is the guy that envisioned everything that we've gone through over the last 30 years in not just a world of technology, but how technology and how the world has evolved. Fascinating guy. Passed away about a decade ago. Was with SRI. Anybody hear of SRI? Stanford Research Institute. You hear Siri, the internet. The world that we know today flowed through not only the institutions that he was a part of, but ultimately, his mind and what he was thinking about. And it came down, his work is best remembered and understood through a relatively simple notion, Amira's Law, which is that we often overestimate, in fact, we consistently overestimate the impact of technology in the short term, which causes us to misunderstand, to overshoot, undershoot, to blow it in terms of the long term. There's countless examples of that. We're going through one of those right now. As we're going through a fundamental shift, if we look at the impact of mobility, of the iPhone, of the notion of that device, and how that has affected companies from a standpoint of developing a mobile-first strategy. From our standpoint, if CMS said to us today, well, in 3 years, we're going to have a mobile app, and that's going to, we've been arguing this with them for 5 years, talking about why we need that. The fact that the consumer isn't sitting in front of a scanner, a PC, the things that were in place perhaps at the beginning of the program. Probably not even then. Certainly not today. So if we could just get them to buy into the importance of mobility, how great that would be. And that is what many organizations have gone through or are going through, where they're so fixated on how can we get that mobile experience to work. But the reality is, it's dead. I've been saying this for 3 years, but we're finally there, where the idea that we can bet on the smartphone, it's gone. Smartphone is dead. We're just seeing, this is the Economist today talking about how this is actually a blessing. We're seeing it in terms of this is having significant economic impact, significant shareholder impact. how companies like Apple are being affected by the fact that we have hit peak smartphone, that we're going to see the smartphone rapidly decline. And in fact, it may even be the Antichrist. But nobody's surprised at that, right? I mean, come on. But one thing we know is that the idea of pivoting from one dominant medium to another is gone. And that we have to think of a world that we are in now where it's not an interface, but in the simplest sense, it's the fact that AI becomes the interface. Look at what has happened with what now is a category of smart speaker, which is kind of a silly thing. Because it is fixated on the physical device. When the Echo came out, what the hell was it? This really expensive, lousy Bluetooth speaker that allowed you to have voice command with Amazon. What he said, brilliant on Amazon's part to get people buying more stuff through Amazon, but boy, that's going to go over like a lead balloon. But who doesn't have a smart speaker of some kind in their home today? Nobody, one person raising. Almost nobody. The reality is you probably do, and it's listening to you right now, you just don't even know it. The reality is the interface is no longer something defined in terms of physicality. The interface is now ubiquitous. And ultimately, it is intelligence that becomes the interface. That it's no longer a thing, but things. And that what we're going through, this notion of digital transformation, is that we're experiencing today a Cambrian explosion where this idea of the interface has been obliterated. Expectations are continuously changing for how we're going to interact with customers. And one of the biggest shifts, and this is foundational to this notion of digital transformation, which really came out of the introduction of the iPhone, but was part of a shift that was going on with the impact of the internet. It used to be, for guys like Chris and me, as we started our career, as we saw consumer adoption of the technologies we had in the office place, that was a long process. And there were these moments where the world thought, boy, we're going to have to fire all the mailmen because everybody's going to have a fax machine, nobody's going to mail letters anymore. Well, the adoption of fax and email and other office technologies in the consumer market took years. What we're experiencing now, what digital transformation is about, is the consumerization of technology, consumer technology that's being adopted by the workplace. So as silly as it seems that you would be conducting work through Alexa, the reality is not only is the workplace, our business experience being shaped by our consumer experience, that cycle happens exponentially faster. So ultimately, we need to think about, when we think about work, that the user experience needs to be defined in how we design work in ways where we can't define the interface in advance. Think about the work that you're doing today. This is why I posed the first thing as a question. How would your job, how would your focus change if, rather than the way that you're designing a function, which starts with how I'm interacting with that function, that goes away, that you cannot predict the way that you're going to perform that work. Instead, you're focused on what's being achieved, goals, outcomes, process, some aspects of integration, but it's not the UI, it's not the screen. And that's where we are. So digital transformation requires, from the standpoint of work, to change the way that we look at work, to re-envision the task in a way where we separate how we perform that task. Are we doing that now? In some ways, we are starting to. We have aspects on the CMS program, some of the innovations, where we are thinking about the outcome rather than the means to achieve it, but largely the systems we build, the way that we design our policies, the way that we envision work instructions and the way that work is going to be performed, we start with how it's going to be done. The work itself and the interface, or the means to perform it, is inseparable. But we are rapidly approaching a world where they are obliterated. They are absolutely separated. So we think about traditional workflow. Pathways are predetermined. It's not that there aren't alternative routes or exceptions, but we define the process in terms of a set of steps and, ultimately, a set of screens. We have some level of sophistication where we divorced the screen from the workflow, but largely, especially on the work that we do today, the workflow and the screen flow are pretty tightly coupled. When we think about how the work that we perform actually evolves, not specifically the system to do that, but the way that work happens, it's highly adaptable. We have lots of exceptions. At any given moment, there's the right answer, but there's a range of possibilities of what to do. And ultimately, how that's being determined, what we do for most of our work, not ESWs, the work that we do, is not being determined by screen flow. It's being determined by context, by policy, by rules, by behavior, by patterns, by all that being stuff that's happened already. What we do next and what we need to do at that moment. How long has that been off? 30 seconds.
It just did it.
It's on my screen. Is it on the line?
No, but it went off. Hit present again. I don't think you're presenting anymore. Yeah, it probably did tighten up the presentation.
All right.
There we go.
Yes? Okay. So for our work, what we do, what our next step is determined by a lot of things other than that predefined workflow. Our systems aren't necessarily designed that way. In some ways they are. We're not sitting in front of an Appian screen. We're not sitting in front of something that's a production environment. We're sitting in front of email and other stuff that's highly adaptable, highly ad hoc, but doesn't have the context, isn't helping us do our job that much better, as illustrated by the start of this presentation. But to use, who uses Waze? And do you like it better where you have no idea where you're going, or where you know? Because really, Waze is operational intelligence for the road. The minute that ETA comes up, your goal is to beat that, right? But Waze is highly adaptable in ways that GPS is not meant to be. Other than traffic conditions, GPS is pretty static. You have a starting point and a destination point, and there's a critical path to get there. But in the case of Waze, and that's actually a screenshot I took at a moment where I knew it would be valuable to me. Because I had faced this juncture where I live, which is, as some of you know, not in the immediate area. When I leave my house to get to the airport, I have two options. And you can think of it in terms of the short way and the long way. The long way is fairly predictable. The short way is often predictable, but it's fraught with risk. So I get to a point where, as you know, I travel quite a bit, so I'm not one of those arrive an hour early kind of guy. I'm a pretty thin margin for error when I get to the airport. So I'm traveling, and I have Waze open. I'm taking this route, not just dozens, probably hundreds of times. Literally, actually, as I think about it. But I have it open, and I'm looking. One thing Waze couldn't predict, because it should be able to, but there's not data being sent out by this, is that there is a drawbridge that when that drawbridge goes up, it's 30 minutes from that point, and it's 45 minutes to retrace my route to go the other way, 30 minutes for it to go down. So basically that drawbridge goes up, at that moment I've missed my flight. There's absolutely no way that I could miss my flight. But I say, you know what, at this point, what do I have to lose? So I take a left, as you see here. At that moment, my ETA was 8:22. There's no way I could have made my flight. I had at least 30, if not 45 minutes additional from where I was at that point. I arrived at maybe 8:24. So the additional time was negligible. Now the pathway that Waze took me on, I could never recreate. It was a pretty hairy ride. And it wouldn't matter though, because that pathway would not matter at any other time. It was at that moment. Waze was making decisions about what is the best way to get there. Not an optimization path on what is the shortest distance, but at that moment, each twist and turn, using real-time data, combined with machine learning, and actually following this, I've spent a fair amount of time looking at how Waze actually does this. There's quite a bit of machine learning being applied. Is that? And Waze is determining exactly at that moment, what should I do? And as a result, I did what is otherwise seemingly physically impossible. So think about that in the context of the way that our business works and that all business works. And all business has a formula that follows this model. That when an event occurs, one thing we know is that the faster we respond and react to that, the more valuable that response is. And that decline of value, the half-life of the value of that event, declines not in a straight line. And frankly, it varies from event to event, obviously it varies from business to business. So putting in metrics on these axes, other than the fact that as time elapses, value declines, that's what's consistent. We know that for just about every business and just about every event, it doesn't decline in a straight line. Meaning that if we resolve it quickly, there's more value. In fact, that value is more than twice as great as it is resolving it twice as fast. Are you following me on that? If we think about this in terms of where we're putting investments, how we're designing our systems, they don't necessarily reflect that fact. Who's read the Black Swan? Nobody. Might be embarrassing, not for me. Anybody see the movie with Natalie Portman? Yeah, right.
Yeah, I don't know.
All right, absolutely nothing to do with the book, by the way. Absolutely unrelated. Nisam Talib wrote The Black Swan about events that cannot be predicted. He was very prominent and it was read by anybody in the financial services space. New York Times bestseller for like 3 years. All right. I'll tell you what though, skip ahead. Don't read the Black Swan. Read Anti-Fragile. So his follow-up book, which was far more pompous than the Black Swan, and largely, it was not anywhere near as well reviewed. But Black Swan made this guy set for life. He's a multimillionaire and a business celebrity. Anti-Fragile kind of got a pass. Anti-Fragile is a far more valuable book. The concept behind Anti-Fragile is absolutely not just fascinating, but it's critical, and it defines the lens in which we need to understand the way that we're leveraging these technologies. So in simplest terms, if you have a fragile company or a fragile structure, and we're talking about organization structure, we're talking about business architecture and everything that goes, but just in basic terms. If I have 3 objects on the table, one of them is fragile. I give it a nominal amount of force and it shatters. The second is rigid. I hit it, doesn't shatter. I really got to hit it hard to really do any damage to it. So you think, well, that's the kind of company we want to be. The third one, the harder I hit it, the stronger it becomes. And it's continuously adapting and taking the force that I'm putting to it Now, there are examples in the physical world. One of the most simplistic is the human body. As you put the human body through stress and strain, the human body becomes stronger. There are not many organizations that when you break it, the bones of that organization heal better. Maybe in an extended sense, but unless that's designed, that really doesn't exist. But think about this from the standpoint of this notion of how we respond to business events and where we put the emphasis on that. And this, the notion of how this declines. Okay, we went through this.
It's back.
So we know that when an event occurs, of any kind, we get a call from a customer. There's some kind of a flare-up with our actual customer, or there's an issue with a consumer, or whatever the event. We know that the faster we respond to that, the more valuable that is. That there's a utility curve where that declines, and if it takes us 3 weeks to respond, it may be that that value now is essentially eroded. What could have been a great, 3 days may have been perfect. 3 weeks, it becomes irrelevant. So the sooner we can respond, the better. But the irony is, the way that we design systems and processes and think about our business, most of the emphasis is put on delivering that response, as opposed to coming up with what is that right response. In fact, very little energy in most cases comes up. Is there? Anybody seen the alleged quote from Einstein? Pretty much every Einstein quote he never said. He never said that insanity is defined by repeating things over and over again. That's nothing he would say. He may have said that when asked if the world was going to end in 24 hours, what would you do? He may have said, I would spend 23 hours coming up with the solution and an hour. Kind of something you might say. The problem is, when an event occurs, we rarely have 23 hours to respond to a 24-hour event, to come up with the right idea. So we immediately get into, it's not that we don't spend any time, but we spend most of our time working on the actual solution rather than really decomposing what that event is. So our investments, our systems, and this is true for just about every organization, is focused on execution. It's focused on the response, as opposed to putting more into being able to interpret that event, to have feelers out there to receive the information about that, and then to decompose that. But if you think about what I went through with Waze, and clearly the response was critical, and all of that's time sensitive. I mean, every twist and turn with Waze followed this. If I sat there and waited 5 minutes to come up with something that was nominally better to go left versus right, and every twist and turn I faced that's not going to work for me. But Waze was able to take the combination of that information happening in real time with rules, policies, things that affect, the context that affects that, plus learning to rapidly give me an answer for take a left. Now, if we're able to apply that to our work by actually learning, not just in the more literal, more traditional sense, but actually leveraging machine learning, applying AI to our event response, then we're not losing that value, that sense and learn moment. We don't have to spend 23 hours coming up with the best solution for a 24-hour problem. We can compress that way. And each time, as we go through that, and we validate whether that is the right answer, we get smarter and smarter. That's how we become an anti-fragile organization. By having that learning loop be inherent in our systems, our processes,